Hi there, this is a small video about Animist Cosmology or worldview. It's about how Animist Cosmology is expressed in the image of Yggdrasil, the world tree. My name is Rune Rasmussen, I'm a historian of religion, and you can patron support my work with renewing our perception of Nordic religion with cutting-edge anthropology. In this video, I'll show you some overlooked, I think, images of the world tree that come from Swedish rune stones, and I'll try to compare this expression of animist cosmology with some of those specific ways that cosmology is imagined today, how it's imagined among scholars of Nordic history of religions, but also among contemporary heathens and pagans who interestingly follow similar paths in this case, and heathens and scholars, that is. However, cosmology is an issue where I think that new animist theory can very substantially contribute to the general understanding of pre-Christian Nordic religion, because cosmology is a very characteristic aspect of animist worldviews, or how animist reality works. And recent scholarship has suggested that animist cosmology differs in very specific ways from Christian and modern cosmology, which in turn share specific characteristics. And these features of Christian and modern cosmology are, for instance, that reality is held together from the outside by strict borders. And the most important border or line of distinction that goes between the divine sphere and the human sphere. Religious agents such as gods and so on, they are outside human reach. They exist in a space of belief. And this kind of cosmology is typically systemically coherent. It's well ordered and internally consistent. And the Christian modern paradigm for cosmology is sometimes called a discontinuous cosmology because of this being distinct from the human sphere. That's something that people think about and conceptually believe in. And that's why it's also conceptually really well structured and, yes, systemic. It is what we sometimes call a belief system. Whereas if you look at the kind of cosmology that you find inside Mongolian shamanism or Brazilian Orisha cult, what I would call an animist cosmology, then I would argue that this kind of cosmology that you also find in pre-Christian religion of Northern Europe, that if you look at those, then you find a reality which is not held together by border from the outside, but by relating from the inside, often ritual relating. The divine sphere is not distinct from human life, but entangled in human life. And this entanglement happens not through belief, but through practice. It's ritual. And it's also characterized by being non-systemic. Conceptually, it can be rather disorganized. Animist cosmology is not, as the anthropologist Morten Axel Pedersen observes, a bonsai mini-version of reality. It's relational, it's a transformational principle of social relating that runs through reality. And as such, it's very syncretic, because belief isn't particularly important, so it doesn't have to be particularly well structured. The notion of the religion as this coherent, systemic unit is a very distinctly modern idea. And what we call religions are really, in animist perception, more like reservoirs of tools to build relation. Like if you think of Saint George, if you think that Saint George works as an image of the West African war god Ogun, then you can include and use Saint George, or the image of Saint George, to manifest Ogun. And so religions and cultures aren't these functionalist, systemic, machine-like things or complexes of meaning where everything fits an exact function and in relation to everything else. But this modern idea is precisely what many project, I think, on ancient cosmology, where understanding something is putting it into system. And you see this tendency, of course, in scholarship, and of course it's almost impossible to escape. I probably also do it myself. But it's also curious that a significant voices among the people trying to re-engage Nordic religion in contemporary form, the Asatru or heathendom complex, certainly not all of them, but some of them, they very explicitly and assertively claim the worldview that or the kind of worldview that's really rather typical of the Christian/modern type of cosmology. For instance, they focus very strongly on distinction making. They make an inside-outside logic as into a foundational cosmic principle. This Utengard, Inengard idea that was also recently criticized by Jackson Crawford, and I very much agree. Some dude wrote a book about that at some point, and I think this perspective on pre-Christian religion is pretty much as close as you can get to the opposite of reality. This is the kind of religion which is focused almost about on the opposite of distinction making. Making is there, of course. You find that in all religion, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's the focus. Rather, I'll say that the focus is on mediation, transgression, and transformation. And like in the modern Christian cosmology, you also find in contemporary Asatru, I think, a focus on the systemic nature, a belief system that can be compromised by syncretism. You know, if something is seen as even potentially influenced by Christianity, that can be disqualified. And there are even pejoratives like wicked true or systemic distortions, foreignisms. This idea that the religion is not empowered by relating with something else in the way that the West African Ogun is empowered by being related through St. George, but that is compromised by it. That's the systemic nature of this typically modern or Christian modern cosmology. I made another video about how this exactly that kind of syncretizing logic is in fact rather evidently visible in medieval Scandinavian religiosity. Well, the most iconic symbol of cosmos in the Nordic pre-Christian religion is, of course, the world tree. And many use the image of the world tree in exactly this bonsai version, a mini-map of reality, where there are these different worlds and they're inhabited by different classes of beings, and it's imagined as this very well-structured system. But if you read the sources, you find that one quite salient feature of Nordic cosmology is that it's very non-systemic. It's almost the opposite. If you sit down and want to map out what where is, then you're likely to be rather confused. And many of the Eddic poems, they refer to parts of reality, but they aren't particularly consistent between each other. But people are trying to create these images of cosmology as if it was possible to map it in the first place. And here's an example. I think it's from a classic work on Nordic myth. This is this is a scholarly example, but you can also find, if you go on the internet, heaps of these Kabbalah-inspired heathen Asatru portrayals or bonsai models of Yggdrasil. And see how this is very much an external viewer that is conceptually imagining a structured idea here. It's detached from the human sphere somehow. It's our thinking of an idea or a perception. And I want to contrast this idea of the Yggdrasil with a pre-Christian image of the Yggdrasil, and this is one that I really love. It's the image of the tree image on the Swedish Ockelbo stone, and notice how the tree is imagined in between a lot of animals and human cultural activities. There's a serpent at the bottom, and there's the bird at the top, symbols of shamanic transformation. And I made a drawing of the tree here to sort of emphasize these two particular human figures. And I might do something with this drawing at some point, perhaps make it available. But to me, this is the most beautiful and quintessential idea of Yggdrasil as an animist principle. It's very distinctly not a mini bonsai map of reality distinct from humans. It's the principle of the world tree as relation with humans and other beings, by the way. The relating is the point. These two figures, human figures, they each hold an object One is approaching the tree with a horn. It looks like he may be pouring a libation to the tree. This is a very common practice in tree worship throughout the history of Nordic animism, where there's always been these sacred trees close to farmsteads and so on. The ancient temple in Uppsala was said to have such a sacred tree placed close to it. The other human figure is holding a ring in one hand and the tree in the other. The ring is an ancient symbol of oath swearing and bonding. The ring is the bond, like a covenant-like symbol. And there's been rings in temples, and collection of rings have been found in archaeological sites of temples, and they probably represent oath swearing to specific gods having taken place in these temples. Probably the most spectacular example of this is the famous Tisø ring, yes, the human figure is holding such a ring and holding the tree with the other hand, almost as if he's swearing himself perhaps into relation with the tree, or perhaps he's using the ring as a symbol of bonding to invoke the power of the tree towards something else. It's impossible to know exactly what's going on, but the point is that both these human figures are ritually engaging the tree. The tree is not an image of something that's external from human life, world, and practice. Its nature is expressed through its its relation with the human sphere, right? These people are practicing their ritual bonding, relating with the tree. And if we switch back to the scholarly modern image, where a contemporary person is trying to imagine herself into the mind of a prehistoric person and imagine what they may have been imagining, or reflect on their reflection, or think about what they perhaps were thinking about a millennia ago, then, I mean, to me at least, this seems really speculative in a very barren, sort of irrelevant kind of way almost. Whereas if you look at the Ockelbo stone with an animist, from an animist perspective, you see the lived ritual reality, the principle of relatedness that is the world tree. It's not a system that sort of lends itself neatly to taxonomies of classes of beings and mappings of the world, or how people look inside their heads, or how their world look inside their heads. It's much more concrete somehow, much more in the practice. And it is the principle of ritual building and maintaining the world as an organic community of relation that humans can build through their ritual practices of sharing and bonding and so forth. And to me, this image illustrates the Nordic view of animism as defined by Graham Harvey as respecting the living world. But of course, also this engagement of ritual respect is not just like flower power, because if you look at the image, you find that the tree simultaneously binds or holds or grows out of what? The dragon, the threat, in fact, to human social space. Observe how it's not distinct, not separated from human social life, this threat, the chaos. It isn't in opposition. These are bound together, depending on each other. And when we read the myths, then this balance with the destructive side of the world appears as problematic or difficult. It's not just harmony. For instance, the story of the binding of the Fenris wolf is a deeply problematic story about deceit and violence and controlling something that doesn't want to be controlled, and which will eventually run loose and destroy the harmonious world. And the Swedish runestones, they kept this matrix into the era that became dominated by Christianity, where the tree became increasingly the cross, and these crosses with their entanglement with the demonic, they're standing on, they're almost growing out of the demonic, they, while also binding or controlling the demonic. It seems, sometimes it almost seems that like this binding is a kind of machinery that produces the harmonious world through this axis mundi. By the way, this is just a piece of modern art that I think has a bit of an axis mundi quality to it. It's called the Love Island here in Copenhagen. I think it's quite impressive. So, well, in my view, these crosses they maintain some of the heathen animist cosmology that we see in the Okelbo stone, where the harmonious world exists not in opposition with dangerous forces, but in some sort of dependency or negotiation, however problematic, on the other destructive side of life. And this machine-like binding of chaotic forces as the root of fortune and harmony recalls a myth of King Frodi on Sealand, who had a magic millstone that was run by two Jotun, or troll giant women, called Fenja and Menja, and that produced this magic millstone. When they grind it, it produced all the fortune of Frodi's kingdom. And like the dragon on these Swedish runestone, or the wolf in Snorri's narrative, these giant forces are bound, they are enslaved somehow, but they also give the blessing and also the destruction to King Frodi's realm. So when he presses them too hard and forget that they are the source of his fortune, then they turn on him and invoke destruction on his kingdom. And it's a different story about this problematic bond that maintained the harmonious world. And these are stories about animist cosmology as relation, as a problematic, negotiated relation, as an organic relation, as a lived relating between humanity and the world that we live in. And that relating can also break down. And when that happens, the result is the Ragnarok, where the tree burns. The animist principle of relatedness breaks down. The cataclysm that ensues when animist relating between humanity and the rest of the world breaks down, that is imaged in the burning of the tree. You know? And when I'm recording this, until 2 weeks ago, there were still koala bears in this world, and the tree is burning, and the burning of the tree is also our loss of relation with the living world that allows our complacency with what an Australian scholar recently diagnosed as an ongoing omnicide, the murderous attack on all life by human civilization. And so the burning of the tree is also our letting this continue without fierce resistance. But, and I made another video about the Völuspá, the Ragnarok myth, from an eco-animist perspective. But yes, this is just a little bit about the Animist Cosmology. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you around.